first thesis presenter, Luke Bennett, with his thesis, Slow Down, Disavowing Medical Speed. Let's give him a hand.
Scott Hahn was a busy man. He took Adderall, an amphetamine-based drug, for the numerous benefits it provided him. In this case, he just wanted to stay awake longer. He took 10 pills, felt amazing, worked hard, and after a long day at work, got in his 1998 Mercedes-Benz to return home. Little did he know, by the time he got to the 14C toll plaza in Jersey City, he was driving erratically, swerving across lanes until he sideswiped a barrier and rear-ended a Chevrolet Malibu belonging to Mr. O'Donnell, a local teacher. Mr. O'Donnell's daughter was also in the car. Mr. O'Donnell's car flew from its place in the eastbound lanes into the westbound lanes, where it collided with a minivan. Mr. O'Donnell was pronounced dead at the scene at 3:41 p.m. His daughter followed a few minutes later. Scott Hahn was charged with 2 counts of aggravated manslaughter and 2 counts of vehicular homicide. Sadly, this is not the only time amphetamines have ruined lives. The phenethylamine class of substances refers to a large family of central nervous system stimulants. These substances speed up mental and physical processes in the body through stimulation of the brain. The specific phenethylamines we want to look at are amphetamine, an amphetamine derivative, methamphetamine, and methylphenidate. These mimic or modify the neurotransmitters in our brain responsible for our fight or flight reactions. Basically, they trick our body into thinking it needs to be ready for peak performance. They achieve this by encouraging the release of neurotransmitters called catecholamines and preventing their reuptake. The catecholamines are norepinephrine and dopamine. Norepinephrine works to increase heart rate and blood pressure in the body, while dopamine is linked to euphoria. All 3 of these drugs are part of the Controlled Substance Act as Section 2 controlled substances. The control system in America works by ranking each drug based on its addictive potential and current accepted medical use and puts them in one of 5 sections. Essentially, Section 5 has lots of current accepted medical use and limited addictive potential, leading to Section 1, which has no current accepted medical use and high addictive potential. Section 1 controlled substances are illegal, whereas the rest of the sections are not, but mostly require prescription, hence them being controlled. Amphetamine, an amphetamine derivative, methamphetamine, and methylphenidate are all kept in the Section 2 controlled substances because of their current accepted medical uses, the treatment of ADHD and narcolepsy. While these medications do indeed treat ADHD and narcolepsy, according to Talbot Recovery, a premier addiction recovery center in the United States, between 2006 and 2011, misuse of Adderall, an amphetamine-based drug, rose around 70%. And as of 2017, almost 2 million people in the United States are suffering from amphetamine addiction. In light of all of this, amphetamine, an amphetamine derivative, methamphetamine, and methylphenidate must all be moved from their place in the Section 2 to the Section 1 controlled substances. This movement of the amphetamines and methylphenidate from the Section 2 to Section 1 controlled substances is crucial for the safety of adults and children. First, this change is necessary because the medical benefits they provide cannot justify the brain damage they cause. The second reason for this switch is that the medical benefits they provide cannot outweigh the addiction they create. And lastly, there's no reason to use risky medications when there are less risky alternatives. The first reason why the amphetamines and methylphenidate should be moved to the Section 1 controlled substances is that the medical benefits they provide cannot outweigh the harm they cause to the human brain. Think of the brain as a computer. The gray matter is the processor, and the white matter are the cords connecting everything together. Any reduction in the number of connecting cables or of the processor itself would greatly impair the function of the computer. The same is true for the brain. In 2000, the first controlled study to measure brain volumes in amphetamine users occurred. The study involved methamphetamine users who had been dependent for at least 2 years, and in order to see if physical changes were occurring within their brains, MRI scans were taken of the patients. They found that the patients on the stimulants had less gray matter in their brains. The brain naturally loses gray matter over time with old age, but amphetamine use speeds this process up. Thus, people are losing overall brain function due to long-term amphetamine use. To further prove this, years later, in 2004, MRI technology improved and another study was done regarding amphetamine use and brain abnormalities. The MRI scans this time used computational image analysis to map the brains of 22 methamphetamine abusers, with an average abuse history of 10.5 years and who are currently using methamphetamine. These patients were matched with 21 control subjects who did not use amphetamines. They found that the methamphetamine abusers had less gray matter in their brains, averaging about 11% below levels found in comparison subjects. They also found around an 8% reduction in hippocampal volumes. Hippocampal volumes, which were smaller in the addicts, were correlated with poor performance on a word recall test. The results of this study are consistent with the results of the earlier. Reduction of gray matter in the brain occurs with long-term amphetamine use, and additionally, memory loss occurs as well. So, we know these drugs hurt the adult human brain, but they also hurt the brains of developing children in utero as well. In a study of children exposed to methamphetamine in utero, they reported around a 13 to 30% reduction in striatal volumes as compared to normal, healthy children. The striatum in the brain is associated with controlling reward and motor systems. In adults, larger striatal volumes are correlated with greater cognitive performance and better ability to learn, and these children had much smaller striatal volumes than normal. Now, the important thing to know is that the physical effects of short-term methamphetamine use would be very similar to the physical effects of long-term amphetamine use. We know this to be true through something called rational drug design. Rational drug design is the process through which modern medications can be made. In the past, if we wanted to cure an illness, we would have to try many different drugs until we found one that worked, which was time-consuming and dangerous. Now, we can use rational drug design, which is based on the knowledge of the physiological responses to receptors in the human body. We find which receptors trigger the physical effects we want, and we trigger those receptors. Thus, it would not be unreasonable to assume that methamphetamine and amphetamine, two chemically equivalent substances that stimulate the same receptors in the human body, would produce very similar, if not the same physiological effects, especially when we are comparing short-term methamphetamine use with long-term amphetamine use. In summary, amphetamine and amphetamine-based drugs reduce gray matter in the brain, which results in deficient neurological and nervous system function, memory loss, and hurts developing children in utero. The second reason why the amphetamines and methylphenidate should be moved to the Section 1 controlled substances is that the medical benefits they provide cannot outweigh the high rates of addiction they create. Each year, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services conducts a national survey on drug use and health. The resulting data shows the addiction rates for adolescents, age 12 to 17, young adults, age 18 to 25, and adults, ages 26 and over. According to their most recent data, in 2017, the number of adolescents currently addicted to the amphetamines and methylphenidate was around 123,000. This is enough to fill the UT Austin football stadium to capacity and have around 20,000 people left over. They also found that the number of young adults currently addicted to these substances was around 715,000. This number is greater than all other prescription mental enhancement drug abuse for young adults, surpassing even pain relievers, tranquilizers, and sedatives. Finally, the number of adults currently addicted to the amphetamines and methylphenidate was around 1 million people. In total, 1.8 million people over the age of 12 are currently addicted to and abusing the amphetamines and methylphenidate in the United States. In comparison to all other prescription mental enhancement drug abuse for people over the age of 12, the amphetamines are in second place, just behind pain reliever abuse, but still ahead of all tranquilizer and sedative abuse. The National Survey on Drug Use and Health only recently began recording addiction rates in relation to the amphetamines and methylphenidate in 2015, but the Monitoring the Future program, conducted through the University of Michigan and funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, has tracked illicit use of the amphetamines since 1975. Their surveys cover around 45,000 students across 8th, 10th, and 12th grades from nearly 400 schools around America. Only 12th grade amphetamine abuse rates have been tracked since 1975, and according to their data, addiction to the amphetamines and methylphenidate fluctuates around 10% of all seniors from year to year. This is significant because it shows that across the years from 1975 to 2018, these drugs have remained a consistent problem. Now, if we wanted to compare the number of prescriptions for these medications to the number of people addicted to these medications, we can look to Medicare. Medicare provides the number of prescriptions for the amphetamines and methylphenidate. And according to their most recent data, in 2016, around 1 million prescriptions for the amphetamines and methylphenidate were prescribed that year. Now, according to the 2016 National Survey on Drug Use and Health, 1.7 million people were addicted to the amphetamines and methylphenidate that year. Almost double the amount of people prescribed these medications are abusing them. The amphetamines and methylphenidate must be made Section 1 controlled substances because the harm they cause from addiction is greater than the medication actually helps. The third reason why the amphetamines and methylphenidate should be moved to the Section 1 controlled substances is that there is no reason to use risky medications when there are less risky alternatives. The primary reason the amphetamines and methylphenidate are kept in the Section 2 controlled substances is that they have current accepted medical uses. These uses, according to the US National Library of Medicine, are the treatment of ADHD and narcolepsy. In regards to the treatment of ADHD, there is a safer answer: atomoxetine. Atomoxetine is the drug that makes up the more commonly known brand Strattera. Atomoxetine has negligible chances of abuse or misuse. Atomoxetine is not a controlled substance in the US, which makes it a primary candidate for patients who run the risk of drug abuse or who do not want to take a controlled substance. Long-term amphetamine use increases the chances of detrimental effects, but long-term atomoxetine use does not. Thus, atomoxetine is successful in the treatment of ADHD and is not addictive, making it a suitable replacement to the amphetamines. In regards to narcolepsy, the drug modafinil, under the brand name Provigil, is an effective alternative to the amphetamines. Modafinil is a controlled substance in the US, but it is a Section 4 controlled substance, meaning it has minimal chances of abuse or misuse. Evidence of this can be found from a research project done at Harvard University. They found that modafinil was successful in the treatment of ADHD and had only one noted serious side effect, and this was the risk of getting a rash. They also found 5 other medications to be effective in the treatment of narcolepsy that also did not have abuse potential as a side effect. When it comes to the treatment of narcolepsy, it is unnecessary to prescribe the amphetamines and methylphenidate, especially when there are clinically just as effective medications that do not have large risks associated with them. All in all, the medical use of the amphetamines and methylphenidate in the treatment of ADHD or narcolepsy is unnecessary, especially when these drugs are very dangerous and there are much less dangerous but equally as effective alternatives. Now, there are some instances where, For example, a child was failing in school due to ADHD, took an amphetamine-based drug, and began succeeding in school. Furthermore, this child did not become an addict and was able to compete at the same level as his or her peers without ADHD. While this example definitely occurs, this example is in the strong minority. Lian Yu Cheng, a doctor at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, says that while the number of prescriptions for Adderall have fallen, we are seeing more medical problems from its use. This suggests that the main driver of misuse and emergency room visits is the result of diversion. Someone taking a medication legitimately prescribed to someone else. While there are a few outliers where these drugs do not have any harmful effects, there is still rampant illegal use in high school and college. In a study of 243 students in dental school, of those that took amphetamines, 90% got them from a friend, and 90% started using the drug in college. Interestingly, only 17% thought amphetamine use was a problem within their institution. This type of illegal use is very hard to regulate, which creates yet another reason why the amphetamines and methylphenidate are not worth the risk for the small group they actually work for, especially when there are just as effective alternatives. Another question that might arise would be, why don't we treat this at the prescription level by better regulating prescriptions and making them harder to get? Well, this has already been happening, but not helping. Recently, prescriptions for stimulants like amphetamine have been made unrefillable, and only 90 days of the prescription can legally be prescribed at once. According to the Monitoring the Future data, these changes have not helped. In 1975, around 70% of all students interviewed said amphetamines would be easily available if they wanted some. This percentage has decreased every year, with now currently 11% of all students interviewed saying amphetamines will be easily available in 2018. The problem is that illicit use isn't on the decline. As stated earlier, currently 1.8 million people in the United States are suffering from amphetamine addiction. Putting more small restrictions on these drugs has not stopped illegal misuse and abuse. Thus, they must be made impossible to get. The amphetamine horror stories are numerous. Richard Fee, an aspiring doctor in medical school and class president, began taking Adderall, convinced he had ADHD. What started off as harmless usage grew into an addiction, and his parents saw this. His mother begged him to get off the pills, saying he didn't have ADHD when he was younger, and he certainly didn't now. His father told the doctor to stop prescribing their son Adderall, saying, "You're going to kill him." These words had little effect, and after Richard became violently delusional and spent a week in a psychiatric hospital in 2011, he met with his doctor and received a prescription for 90 more days of Adderall. He hanged himself in his bedroom closet 2 weeks after finishing the last of them. The amphetamines and methylphenidate harm people, attacking the brain and causing addiction, which cannot be justified, especially when there are just as effective alternatives. Medications are meant to help people, and the amphetamines and methylphenidate have hurt too many. It is time these substances became Section 1 controlled substances so they can harm no one else. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, on Luke's panel, we have Amanda Boyer, who works for pharmaceutical product development and has been in pharmaceutical industry for almost 20 years. Her family has been at Veritas for 3 years, and she has girls in 7th and 8th grade and a boy in 4th. We also have Norman Furley, who's the Director of Investor Relations at Baines Creek Capital, an Austin-based hedge fund. He also serves at Veritas as an 8th grade boys discipleship teacher. He's a husband, a father of 4 sons, and a follower of Jesus Christ. We also have Sandra Moore, his advisor, who runs the scariest 9th grade biology class ever, according to my 9th graders. And we have Graham Donaldson, who has to admit he's a little disappointed. He was expecting that slow down disavowing medical speed meant enforcing speed limits on emergency, vehicles. So, ambulance, that's the word I was looking for. All right, so in front of you, you have a paddle. Show me the white side, and it means new question. Show me the red side, and it means follow-up question, and you get priority. So the floor is open. Go for it.
Great job, Luke.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you could clarify a little bit more between amphetamines and methamphetamines, please.
Right. So methamphetamine has an additional methyl group, which makes it more lipid soluble, so it passes through the blood-brain barrier faster. Basically, what this would mean is that it would react faster within the human body. So I guess you could think that the studies concerning methamphetamine wouldn't be super applicable to the studies concerning amphetamines. But around 2 weeks ago, a study in the New England Journal of Medicine came out that showed 1 in 600 people on these ADHD medications I'm talking about, even the prescribed users, 1 in 600 would achieve high-level psychosis at some point in their life. And I researched what triggers of high-level psychosis was, and one of these triggers was reduction of gray matter. So now we have proof that amphetamines do reduce gray matter in the brain.
Just to follow up on that, great job, Luke. So yeah, in your speech you said that a small amount of methamphetamine is the same as a large amount of just regular amphetamine. Is that correct?
Over a large
period, yeah.
So using methamphetamine for a short amount of time would be equivalent to using amphetamine for a lifetime, for example.
So why not have methamphetamine be the Section 1 controlled substance and leave amphetamine as a Section 2?
Right. So the reason I wouldn't be comfortable doing that is that eventually, there's a proven tolerance that occurs to the ADHD drugs. So over time, you'll have to increase your dosage. And ADHD is a lifelong disorder now. That's how it's defined. So eventually, you have to increase your dosage, and the effects would get very similar to the effects of methamphetamine. So they both need to be rescheduled in order to protect everybody.
So for clarity's sake, I'm curious, and maybe you explained it and I just didn't get it. So when we talk about the sections 1 to 5, where do prescriptions fall into that realm?
So Section 1 controlled substances are illegal except by federal prescription, meaning that they basically can only be used except for research purposes. A federal prescription is very hard to get. Then 5 through 2, so the rest of them, you can get, but with a prescription from your doctor. So basically, you have to go to your doctor, get it prescribed, and then you can get the medicine.
So is 5 harder for a doctor to prescribe? Pardon me, would a 2 be harder to prescribe for a doctor than a 5?
There's not a difference between difficulty for a doctor to prescribe.
Okay.
Only 90 days can legally be prescribed at once. So once the 90 days are up, the person would have to come back and get a new prescription. But Section 5 is not harder than Section 2.
Thank you.
And
for the drugs that you were saying are safe alternatives, have there been studies that show those compared to amphetamines?
Yes. So in the Pediatric Drugs 2009 edition, Dr. Carly P. and Garnick Jones and Gillian M. Keating did a double-blind comparison on the effects of atomoxetin in people, and they found that. So atomoxetin works on the norepinephrine transmitters, and not the dopamine receptors. So amphetamines work on dopamine receptors and norepinephrine receptors, and atomoxetin only works on norepinephrine receptors. Basically, it makes you focused, but it doesn't make you feel good at the same time. So atomoxetine it treats the ADHD because it helps people focus, but it does not allow for the dopamine rush, which is part of the reason that causes addictions to these substances. As for modafinil, the Harvard sleep study that they did was also a double-blind comparison. So they found that modafinil treated the symptoms, but did not release the high that is created from the amphetamines and methylphenidate.
Yeah, to follow up on this, so then what is the active ingredient in, what's it called, atomoxetine? And did you look at the active ingredient and see if it's in any other drugs that have any other problems or addiction problems that you researched?
So atomoxetine works on, wait, sorry, can you restate the question?
So the active ingredient. So the active ingredient in Adderall is the amphetamine. What's the active ingredient in atomoxetine? That's
So
dealing
the
with the
brand
norepinephrine.
name would be, so the brand name would be Strattera, and then the drug is atomoxetine.
So, okay, gotcha.
So that's, okay. So that would be the active ingredient, I guess you could say. And then that works on the neurotransmitter norepinephrine receptors. Yeah.
So if research is showing that these drugs are possibly safer and more effective, why wouldn't doctors be prescribing these as a first line for prescriptions?
Right. So basically, this has been happening a long time with pain relievers. There is many studies that show that ibuprofen does the same clinical effects as some of the high-level pain relievers, but people still request the higher level pain relievers. And if they do the same thing clinically, there's really only one reason why they would pick the other ones, and that's that you get a high off of them. And so people want the Adderall, they want the Ritalin, they want the Disoxin because they achieve the high off of them. And you don't achieve those with the Strattera, which is made up atomoxetine, and the modafinil.
So then you're making the claim that parents or patients themselves are requesting Adderall? And can you just speak to that relationship between doctor and patient if the patient is requesting a specific drug, whereas if the doctor has alternatives to that drug?
Right, so one of the arguments that's brought up would be that the Adderall and the Ritalin are more effective than the Strattera. And the reason why people bring those up is because in studies by the companies that make Adderall and Strattera, they interview the patients after taking them, and of course the patients, if they interview them, are going to say they like one over the other because one makes you feel really good. And so, also to add to this, there's a study from Professor David Perry at the University of Kentucky that said 5 minutes on Google was enough to fake the ADHD test to show that you had ADHD. So if someone wanted the Adderall or Ritalin, 5 minutes on Google, they can go in, it says they have ADHD, and then the doctor would pick the top prescribed one, which would be Adderall at this point.
So essentially what you're saying, I'm trying to understand, is the crux of the problem the demand?
Yes. Yes, a bunch of people. So, I mean, addiction is really nothing to be scoffed at. And when people are addicted, the craving for these substances is huge. And people really want these substances. And it gets to the point where you think you really can't live without them, like the stories I used in my intro and conclusion.
That's right.
So people need these substances so bad that they'll go to any point to get them.
You also mentioned in your presentation that Adderall prescriptions are falling. Did you happen to see why those prescriptions are falling? You said Adderall prescriptions are falling, but it's still getting out there and people are abusing them. Falling between what time period, and do you have any speculations as to why they were falling?
So they're falling in between, so the survey I was covering was between 1975 in 2018. So they've been falling over that period of time. And why they would be falling. So I have a theory. I think that since diversion is a huge so diversion is when someone gets a medication legitimately prescribed to someone else. That's a big problem with the use of these drugs right now. So I believe that less people are getting them because they can just easily get them from their buddy in college and use them if they want. They don't need to go to the doctor's office. They can just get them from a friend.
Oop, Norman beat you to it. What a gentleman.
Why do you feel making them illegal will reduce, the abuse? Because if somebody really wants something, they're going to get it whether it's legal or not, potentially. So.
Right. So there could be. So what sometimes is created when a drug becomes illegal is the balloon effect. So basically, if you're squeezing air out of a balloon, it'll go to a place of lesser resistance. And that could happen with making these drugs illegal, is that some company in Europe could start making an Adderall knockoff. But that wouldn't be super economically, that would not be a good economic decision for them to make, because ADHD is really only a thing in the United States. Basically the vast majority of the world, ADHD is not a common diagnosis. So I don't believe that outside markets would start feeding the United States amphetamine problem. Also, a lot of the people on this substance are younger, like they're kids, so they'd have to get it from their parents, and I'm sure that their parents wouldn't go to, like, these are just normal people. I'm sure that normal people wouldn't go to huge ways to get these substances, especially if they're just normal families that go to school. And yeah.
Follow up.
Your argument, though, has seemed to be geared more towards adults and abusers, not necessarily young kids that are being prescribed this by their pediatrician. So how do you differentiate that?
So there is a study from, hold on, let me see, Dr. Richard Saul, and he showed that small children actually do receive a high from these substances. So there was a common misconception a while ago that children did not become addicted to these substances, but they actually can, and they do. So what can happen is, so how the study worked is that a bunch of kids started saying they didn't like the higher levels of doses of Adderall they had to be getting, and so the doctor went to understand why, and when he found out why, he interviewed the kids that he was giving the medication to, and they described the symptoms that matched with the described symptoms from adults of being high. So the children described that they were getting a high from these drugs, and their descriptions matched the descriptions that adults like at that point. So does that answer your question? Okay.
So when you're talking about brain damage, gray matter reduction, there's sort of two types of users that you're talking about in your thesis. Those who are abusing, so I'm assuming that they're having much higher dosage, like the guy in your beginning who took 10 Adderall and then went driving. And then there's those who are prescribed it and are doing the daily recommended prescription. Any difference in the damage based on those who are following their doctor's prescription versus those that are abusing the substance?
Right, so if people using Adderall could just use this medication one time for final exam and then not want to use it again, that would be great, and these drugs wouldn't be a problem. But what happens is that people that are prescribed it start using it more and more, and when you use it more and more, the tolerance occurs, so you have to increase your dosage. So at some point, the heavy users would equal the casual users, I guess you say, or the people that are using it for the prescription. Yeah.
So you've done a great job in making it very clear that we're in the middle of a particular period of time where attitudes and access to this really need to change. Is there something in our history, whether it be a treatment in the medical community or the psychiatric community, that you can look back on and say, hey, what we're in right now is real similar to what we were in a long time ago when we used to do, and we would no more do that than we would do any other crazy thing? Is there something that you can look back on and say, this is really analogous to that?
I mean, America has had an interesting relationship with drugs throughout the years, and I mean, there was a point at time in America's history where there would just be cocaine on the table for you to use. And so it seems like not each generation, but over time, there's always one substance that becomes a problem, and then it's treated. And then another substance that becomes a problem for so long that it needs to be treated. And amphetamines have started becoming a problem for so long at this point, I think it's time for a change to be made.
So to follow up with that, so then can you give me an example of something that has gone from a Section 2 to a Section 1? Was its rollout smooth? Did illegal use in that thing balloon? Is there precedent for moving something from a 2 to a 1 that is going to alleviate any sort of worries that people have about you're driving all these people to become criminals or whatnot?
So from what I know, there hasn't been any other drug quite like the amphetamines that are being used in this way that has been moved from Section 2 per se to Section 1. But I mean, the drugs have switched sections. I mean, right now, there's an argument to move marijuana to Section 2, so from Section 1 to Section 2. So it can happen. I'm not sure that there's one specifically that's like this case that has happened before.
And then also sort of similar in this line, I just forgot it, which is embarrassing because I'm in front of everybody. What was it? Gosh darn it. Sorry, Luke, can't remember it.
All right.
Oh, yeah, there it is. Okay, so the history of this. So when amphetamines first started being produced, were they originally produced with ADHD in mind, or did they have an earlier accepted medical use that maybe shifted or changed?
So when the drug was made, it was not for the treatment of ADHD. The doctor was actually trying to treat asthma, and then realized that this drug didn't help asthma users, but they felt great using it. So it seems like that we have this substance that works really well within people and gets a great reaction. And so over the years, we've been trying to find uses for it, and ADHD is this current use that it's being used for. Also, ADHD is not necessarily a bad thing. There have been many successful people who actually attribute their success to having ADHD. I know David Beelman, who's the owner of JetBlue, never treated his ADHD, and he says that he actually became successful because of this. For example, he invented the electronic ticket system, which is super popular now, and he attributes that because of his forgetfulness from ADHD. Or Michael Phelps, for example, had ADHD and treated it through swimming, and he's very successful now.
I can go all day. All right. Differentiate this to me with Ritalin. You didn't talk too much about Ritalin in your talk. Is Ritalin also an amphetamine-based substance?
So it is methylphenidate. That's why when I said we need to move amphetamines, methamphetamine, and methylphenidate, I was targeting Adderall, which is amphetamine, Desoxyn, which is methamphetamine, and then Ritalin, which is methylphenidate.
And then all those studies about the brain and gray matter and addiction, they apply to Ritalin as much as Adderall?
Yes, because the basis of my response would be through rational drug design. They made Ritalin to act exactly like Adderall, but just be a different drug so they could sell it. So it reacts the same way. It stimulates the same receptors, which is really key, and it's also considered chemically equivalent.
What about the cost? Is there a cost difference between the different drugs?
So between Adderall and Strattera, so this gets complicated because different insurances do different things to the cost of medicine. But from what I found, the cost of Adderall and the cost of Strattera, which was my proposed alternative, were pretty similar. At some points, Strattera was about $9 more expensive. But modafinil, the generic version of modafinil, was way cheaper than Adderall or its alternative. So modafinil was the cheapest, and then the price difference between the first two is negligible.
All right, and that's 20 minutes. Thank you, Luke.